Welcome. How is it that understanding the Constitution has become so difficult for most ordinary Americans? Well, the progressives deliberately complicated it in a way through constitutional law, which is not the same thing necessarily as the Constitution itself.
The Baker Brief with law professor John Baker. Your weekly dispatch from the battlefield of ideas.
The Constitution is supposed to be understandable to ordinary Americans, and much of the language is very clear. So, for instance, the age specified for running for the House, the Senate, and the President, they're all clearly spelled out. And in many ways, this is not, quote, exciting stuff because it's so clear. And many Americans just think, well, this is the government. They don't think of it necessarily as, quote, the Constitution. Now, there are other matters that are necessarily more complex because they involve the conflict over the two main structures of the Constitution, namely federalism and separation of powers. Those are situations where either the federal government and the state governments are in conflict. And the Supreme Court is ultimately going to settle those questions because they are matters of interpretation. The same thing with separation of powers among the branches. But much of what goes to the Supreme Court these days, and for a long time, has involved the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about, but it involves a lot of other things that basically wouldn't be there but for the administrative state and the complexity that it has created. So we want to talk about that a little bit because within this background, we find that unfortunately some of our leaders have a fundamentally flawed understanding of the Constitution. So let me give you a relatively modern or recent example. It was reported in about to be released book that the then head of the joint the example reported in this book is about the then head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in which he disagreed with President Trump. And he was entitled to disagree and to advise the president, but ultimately, under our system of civilian control of the military, it is the president as commander-in-chief who makes decisions, and it is the Congress under its powers to restrain the president in terms of financing of wars and other things, and investigation. But it is clearly not in the judgment of particular members of the military. If they don't want to follow what the president wants done, then it is their obligation to resign. But there is a different understanding that some people have come by, and that is that somehow their commitment to the Constitution is something that's not in the Constitution. So in this book, it was reported that the general involved said he would, quote, fight from the inside rather than resign. Well, there couldn't be a clearer violation of his responsibility. It endangers the republic. And importantly, this is not the kind of decision that would ever be reviewed by a court. So in other words, there are certain fundamental principles that Americans have to understand that are constitutional and agree to them. But it is additionally reported that he was doing this in order to defend the Constitution. Well, wait a minute. He doesn't understand the Constitution. How is that? Well, like many Americans, at least in education, I can't say what goes on in the military academies, but at least in education up until college, and certainly in college, if you're not in a military institutional college, we're getting the progressive view. And it's gotten away from certain basics. At the same time, we also had going on conversations apparently between the Speaker of the House and the same general. Well, wait a minute. That's not the role of Congress at all. The two of them were interfering, undermining the Constitution. But they were doing it, apparently, they think, in defense of democracy. Well, wait a minute. Is your idea of democracy the progressive view, or is it the one in the Constitution? Now, I'm not saying there's only one view on all constitutional matters. There aren't. I just acknowledge that. On matters of separation of powers and federalism, there are often, usually, reasonable debates over what the particular application could be, and that is to be resolved in the courts, not on the sidelines, but by other players deciding what democracy demands. All of this can be traced back initially, at least, to education. But if there is one thing we're supposed to agree on, is civilian control of the military. There are other barriers related to the problem's understanding, but this is a clear one, or at least it should be clear. But we now have in the next program, which is on the date of the start of Constitution Week, in fact, Constitution Day, September 17th, we'll be talking about how is it that it is so difficult for people to understand the Constitution when it was made in a way so that ordinary people could understand. And the complicated parts, as I mentioned, federalism and separation of powers, that are subject to court opinions. They're opinions. They are to be drafted in such a way as to be persuasive and understandable to ordinary Americans. Unfortunately, since the progressives, most notably Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who many conservatives look up to, he changed the view of the Constitution and the role of the courts from saying what the Constitution means, says, to making the law. There is a big difference. The latter, the progressive view, is not the rule of law at all. I hope you join me next week as we launch more immediately into the structure of the Constitution. Thank you.
To ensure your continued access to the Baker Brief, please note our additional channels listed below. And remember to like and subscribe using the bell icon.